Can we start the session?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're live on YouTube now, so we can begin. I will be handing the mic to Stephen now, who's the rapporteur for this session, and he will introduce our chair and open the session. Thank you so much.
Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome Dhanashree ma'am and Sean Pugh sir. I'll introduce the chair for the session, which is Dr. A. Sean Pugh. Dr. A. Sean Pugh is an associate professor of Hindi language and South Asian literature and culture at Michigan State University. His book, I Too Have Some Dreams, N.M. Rashid and Modernism in Urdu Poetry, was published by the University of California Press in 2014. He has served as the director of the Digital Humanities program at Michigan State University and recently received an Andrew W. Mellon New Directions Fellowship that allowed him to study linguistics and computer data science for his current research on poetics sound in South Asian poetry. He holds a PhD in Middle East and Asian languages and cultures and comparative literature and society from Columbia University. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be chairing this session. I'm also very glad I made it because my alarm didn't go off properly, so I had so I was so I was very fortunate. I don't know what happened. I think I need to get a new phone for Christmas. So the I'm very delighted to shall I introduce the speaker? Is that?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay. All right, 1 second. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dhanashree Thorat from the Mississippi State University, who's going to be presenting a paper on digital literary studies in uncertain times. So I've been admiring Professor Thorat's work, and from afar, we haven't met before, so I'm very excited for this presentation. Thank you. But let me say further that Professor Thorat is an assistant professor of English at Mississippi State University, which is really funny for me because I'm at Michigan State University, so I often type in MSU and I get one or the other to come up, and there's also the University in Baroda. So her research is situated at the intersection of Asian American studies, post-colonial studies, and digital humanities. Broadly, she examines how colonial and racial ideologies shape the technological imagination, specifically in technical infrastructures, platforms, and policies. Dhanashree is a founding executive council member of the Center for Digital Humanities, Pune in India, and she serves as the lead organizer for a biennial winter school on digital humanities and advises the Center on Digital Archival Practices projects, and DH curriculum developments. And so I'm very much looking forward to this presentation. And the move that we're seeing towards thinking about infrastructure is something that we're kind of seeing across the academies. I'm sure you're aware, and it's very significant. And thinking about we're talking more in particular about things such as the stack that we're all dealing with. And I'm having I've been thinking about the infrastructure a lot this semester because I'm teaching a lot of students in China. And so none of the Google products work. And so we're winding, and then Zoom is potentially under surveillance. And Microsoft seems to be a good actor and has open source software and is supporting education stuff. So it's a very new world for us right now. So I'm very excited about this. And I hope that we can get guidance as we move forward in our own deliverables for this SPARC project as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction, Sean. Should I go ahead and get started? Are we set to go?
Yes, surely.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to quickly set my timer here because This is such an exciting conference on a topic that's very dear to my heart, and I'm going to try not ramble on over time. So good evening, everyone. Good morning for those of you who are in the United States and waking up very early, like Sean, to join us today. I'm really excited to be here. I am an English literature person. My PhD is in English. And my research has kind of meandered a little. I'm currently working on a book project about undersea internet cables, literally like cables and pipelines. And so sometimes people ask me, how are you an English person? How are you a literature person writing about infrastructure? But this conference has been so exciting to see this kind of attention to different forms of textuality, different genres that have emerged in the digital medium. And it's been really exciting to kind of sit in on some of your sessions. So thank you, Professor Zaidi, for inviting me to this really exciting event, and to all of you for pulling it off. So what I'm going to do today, if I could share my screen, and if someone could just tell me if you can see what I am sharing.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes.
Excellent. And what I want to talk to everybody, there we go, about today is this connection between digital humanities, activist interventions, and community accountability. And I'm going to try and kind of join two different threads of conversation. The first question I'm going to take up is, what does digital humanities offer for scholars who study literature or other kinds of texts? And then the second question that I'm going to add to that is, what are possibilities for digital humanities practitioners to intervene in the kinds of crises that we are seeing unfolding around us at the moment? What are our responsibilities really as scholars in this moment? And as you've seen from this conference, just the last few days, digital humanities offers, quite a few tools, methods, toolkits for scholars who study literature or other kinds of texts and textuality. So we have new kind of computational methods for doing humanities research. These methods include, for example, computational text analysis. I think Professor Amardeep Singh spoke about this briefly on the first day. And we can do network analysis, sentiment analysis, all kinds of other work. We can read and analyze these large corpora, whether they are 100 novels or 100,000 tweets. And we could not do that at scale before. We also have these new sites of study, right? So e-literature, social media, digital games, cyber culture, and so on. And these are all kinds of genres and spaces where literature scholars can apply their analytical and methodological skills that we have developed already. Another area, and one that I am more interested in, is really that DH opens up several democratizing possibilities. And I mean making text accessible to broader audiences and sharing of scholarship without barriers to access. Paywalls and expensive databases hinder scholars, especially in the global south, from accessing knowledge. And I really don't have to say this to any of my Indian colleagues, with all of you in the room, because you're very familiar with this. I just found out yesterday, in fact, that Wiley, Elsevier, and another group has filed a lawsuit, which is going to be heard in the High Court of Delhi on the 24th of December, where they are trying to ban all Sci-Hub and LibGen website addresses in India. And these are, of course, pirate sites where everybody gets access to material that they do not institutionally have access to. So by insisting on, open access publications, we have new ways of sharing our scholarship without these limitations. In the Indian context, this is exemplified by digital library projects, the National Digital Library of India, Shodh Ganga. And we also have scholars like Nirmala Menon, Padmini Ray Murray, and others who are really working on DH projects to decolonize knowledge pathways in different contexts and different ways. This last project that I've listed here is actually a textbook project that the Center for Digital Humanities has just taken up. And we are essentially producing an open access version of an introductory textbook to digital humanities. I'm currently actually reading some of the pieces that have come in for that, but when the project goes live next year, it's going to be a full textbook with resources, sample assignments, a bibliography, but we really want this to be accessible to a broader audience. The democratizing potential of DH also refers to digitizing and creating digital archives pertaining to minoritized experiences that have historically been erased or marginalized. And I will return to this a bit later in the talk. And as scholars who study literature, we have opportunities now to highlight literary texts that have existed on the margins of the white Euro-American canon and in languages other than English. When I was in school in India, we primarily studied British literature in high school and in college, right? I remember Wordsworth, I remember Shakespeare. I could not tell you about any of the Indian authors we read. English was and continues to be emphasized as the linguistic medium for professional and social success. Earlier today, Prakriti Manyar was one of the participants who spoke about this in her talk, that when you think about literature in India, the first thing you think about is English literature. And how do we come to that kind of assumption? Now, this kind of colonial model of education is very much grounded in what the British left us, right? This is Macaulay's Minute on Indian education, where he's talking about how, Indian languages and dialects have, neither literary nor scientific information, right? So it's a very kind of statement of breathtaking arrogance from a man who admitted to actually not knowing any of the native languages that he has kind of cast judgment on here. And Indian history really testifies to the many ways in which the Eurocentric canon has taken over Indian education based on these kinds of racist assumptions of native inferiority and technological backwardness. And this is the same model that in some ways we've continued to follow decades after independence. And this is really where the open access possibilities of digital humanities held so much liberatory promise. We can digitize literary texts that were once considered to not have merit, right? Which were not a part of this white Euro-American canon. We can digitize papers, letters, other archival documents that fell outside of the colonial archive. And this is where I find Membe's work on decolonizing the university really interesting and rich, because he is thinking about what he calls pluriversity, which is a university that embraces epistemic diversity via this kind of horizontal strategy of openness, where there is dialogue between different epistemic traditions rather than having one kind of tradition dominating the others. Of course, this model challenges the privileging of English, of Euro-American scholars and writers, and forms of knowledge dissemination which are inaccessible to those in the global south. So what digital humanities offer then is the possibility of destabilizing canonical formations and normative academic codes. We had this potential of forming new dialogic communities and working collaboratively across disciplines. And yet, when we take stock of the field at the moment, we can see where this remains an incomplete project. Of course, lack of funding, lack of infrastructure, lack of training, again, 3 areas that my Indian colleagues are very familiar with, have really kept DH from accomplishing these kinds of projects and goals. And I have a feeling Professor Rupika Risam probably talked about this in her talk, in her keynote earlier in the conference. Also troubling is the entrenchment and reproduction of traditional academic hierarchies and power structures in this new field. right? So digital technologies might offer the opportunity to reinvigorate the study of Marathi literature, but that's not going to happen if there is no funding, right? That's going to digitizing that literature. Or if we don't have platforms that can perform machine reading of some of these minoritized language literatures. So the structural limitations remain in place, right? And we've seen this in the United States and we've seen this in India. So this is the first thread that I kind of want you to hold on to, of these possibilities of digital humanities and open access, and how these possibilities are curtailed by hierarchical structures of power. Those of you who work in fields like gender studies are well aware of how resistant our academic, cultural, and government institutions can be to these conversations. Sarah Emma says that, when we raise these conversations, we become the killjoys, right? We become the problems for raising these conversations. Now, the second thread that I want to kind of join to that first one is that we've witnessed these remarkable political activisms in many parts of the world in the last 10 years. And these are activist movements precisely against systemic problems, against structural issues, which also vex us in academic contexts. Activism has been a kind of keyword, right? A cultural touchstone for this decade. In the US, we've had Black Lives Matter protests very notably in this last summer. This first picture is actually from Starkville, where I currently live. And we had the biggest march in Starkville since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, right? So there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration. In India, there have been protests against the citizenship bill and ongoing protests by farmers at the moment. And I do want to note here and give a shout out really to Jamia students who were a very active participants in the anti-CAA protests in Delhi, and as we know, faced police brutality during their marches. So these stories of students involved in or leading protests has been repeated elsewhere. And as an educator in this moment, the question I ask myself is, what is my responsibility when our students are on the streets? How do we pursue digital humanities in India when Kashmir has been in the longest ever internet shutdown, right, in any democracy ever? What are our commitments as DH scholars when the government exerts its regulatory authority unfairly against minoritized people in the country? So we can't even begin to remedy the problem of the digital divide of Indians without access to the internet when our own government is complicit in denying internet access to its citizens. And I do want to also give a shout out to Nishant Shah here, who had this really fantastic article, I think 2 years ago, on what he calls post-access digital humanities, where he kind of anticipates this happening. And then, of course, we also have this global pandemic, right, to reconcile with. All of you have been teaching online. It has probably been a fairly difficult experience. And students are struggling, right? Instructors are struggling. So what does digital humanities do in this current moment? Where do we stand in relation to these minority activisms? How do we respond as scholars to the rise of anti-immigrant, Islamophobic, and white supremacist movements in the United States and India? So to join these two threads, right, first, the stalled promise of digital humanities, and second, activist movements against structural oppression, I'd like to make a case for DH practitioners to respond to these socio-political emergencies in their local and national contexts. Because these are very much part of our context, right? We cannot ignore what's happening outside of our classrooms. And what's happening is not separate from our roles as researchers and educators. Black digital studies scholar Jessica Marie Johnson frames these kinds of concerns along the lines of accountability. She argues that a justice imperative grounds the role and relevance of the humanities in a changing world, and we must ask ourselves whether we are accountable to our students and to the communities our universities are located in. We can think about these communities in many ways, right? So it can be local communities, it can be social, cultural, and dialogic communities that we choose to belong to, transnational, diasporic, and global communities, and also our sense of kind of planetary belonging, right? And its ecological dimensions. To think through community in this way is also to attend to its exclusions, right? And its marginalizations and the erasures within our spaces. Among other aspects, community accountability implies that we create an equitable learning space, center the voices and experiences of community members, especially historically marginalized voices, and connect our scholarly work to the communities that we are part of. Instead of simply adding to the canon or making a place at the table, right, which are kind of terrible metaphors, we consider how to disrupt the canon and re-envision equitable academic structures. The scope of the humanities, I think, especially of literature, art, film, digital storytelling, and other forms of cultural expression are precisely the capacity of imagination, of being able to envision new worlds, and of opening up these foreclosed possibilities. This is where we can intervene as scholars. Now, this model of education, of liberatory praxis and pedagogy that I'm suggesting is not unknown, right? We have a lot of models for this, and we certainly have models in India as well. One example from Pune is of the Fules, who started one of the first schools for women in Pune. And they were feminist visionaries who envisioned educational access for women and oppressed castes. For the Fules, access to education was also critical in breaking the shackles of caste oppression because it enabled minoritized people to have access to knowledge that had been denied to them. So in her poetry, Savitribai Phule has this really wonderful line where she exhorts students to join together and learn so that they can smash traditions and liberate. And so they articulated this kind of pedagogy oriented around a process of collaboration, co-learning, and dismantling systemic oppression. Right? This was not just about learning English or learning to adopt the codes of education, but really transgressing them, right? Thinking about the limitations of those codes. This kind of liberatory learning space is also envisioned by Bell Hooks in her work on community pedagogy. And she has this wonderful phrase where she talks about, enabling an insurrection of subjugated knowledge. And I really love that phrase, right? An insurrection, right, which is a revolt, a mutiny against an active rejection of normative codes. And it's an insurrection of subjugated knowledge, knowledge which was quashed, which was considered insignificant, or which was considered too dangerous to be taught. And these are the kinds of traditions that we can draw on, right, as scholars and as teachers. Enacting this kind of pedagogy in India, of course, means that we have to acknowledge that issues of gender, sexuality, caste, class, and colorism are co-constituted. And we have to be accountable to how they play a role in our learning communities as well. So this tradition of activist scholars, of public intellectuals, community-based scholarship also has a long genealogy in fields like ethnic studies. So in the United States, we know that Black studies, Indigenous studies, Native American studies, Indigenous studies, and Latinx studies, Asian American studies. I think I've repeated one of those. But all of these basically came out of the 1960s activist movements led by students in California who said, our curriculums are not giving us what we need. And so we need these ethnic studies disciplines that will address these ignored histories. So we've got all of these rich models, right, which we can look to. And what I really want to point out here is that DH might be a new field, But we have these kinds of people to look up to, right? We can bring in these histories when we think about what DH could potentially do for us. In digital humanities, of course, this kind of community engaged, social justice oriented scholarship has been exemplified by many scholars who were part of Transform DH in the early years. Moya Bailey and Kong Huyen, folks like Rupika Risam, of course, were very involved in this, right? Who've really kind of established this tradition already, even within the field. And this is scholarship in action, scholarship as action, but also scholarship as intervention. And I'll share some examples of what that might look like. So earlier I began with this first question, right? What does digital humanities offer to scholars? I want to kind of reframe that question now and say, what approaches, methods, tools, and skill sets does digital humanities offer to activist scholars, right? When we choose to intervene in these kinds of moments of crisis, what does digital humanities do for us, right? What tools does it give us? And I'm not suggesting that we become community organizers or we become activists. I don't know if academics have those skill sets, right? So we have to be very careful not to step over other people's roles as well, right? But what can we do in our context? So, what are the possibilities for intervention, disruption, and transformation within digital humanities? So, I want to walk you through a few projects, and then I'm going to give you a pedagogical example that illustrates what these possibilities are. And then I'll talk about ethical considerations to kind of wrap up our conversation. So these are two examples of scholarship as kind of intervention, as rapid response to political crisis. The first one on the left is the Thorat project, which was launched in the United States very quickly over one summer. And it basically visualizes the geography of detention centers. And this was launched as a result of what was happening in the United States when President Trump signed this order, which separated children from their families, the migrant families that were crossing the border. And the children were basically separated and put in separate camps, and the families were put in separate camps. There was a lot of outrage about this, and this project was visualizing the geography of these detention centers, who was getting money, which states were getting funding. And this other project on the right here is actually a project about Kashmir, which reflects on how Indian citizens become complicit in state violence. It was launched, I think, late last year as a result of everything we were hearing about the internet shutdown and the violence unfolding in Kashmir. And this was done by Dia da Costa. It's actually based on Esri's ArcGIS platform. It's a kind of digital storytelling platform where a narrative is interwoven with images and other kinds of multimodal content. I do apologize for not including links on here. If anybody's interested, I can share the PowerPoint later on with some links on here so you can also look at these later. So both of these projects are kind of addressing, they're pulling on digital humanities tools, right? These are both map-based projects. So they're drawing on a digital humanities method and participating in a conversation about political crises, political conversations that are unfolding in a very contemporary moment. And the goal, of course, is to spark conversations, to get more public awareness. And both of these projects really work as academic projects, right? They're not trying to be anything else. They are situated within scholarly traditions. We also have examples where projects document activist movements themselves, right? And this is of particular interest to me right now because we have seen so many activist movements, right? What happens to these movements 10 years down the road? How do we keep these kinds of legacies alive, right? How do we memorialize what has happened? And two examples of this, one from the US, this is the Baltimore Uprising Archive Project. And this is documenting Black Lives Matter marches that happened in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was killed by the police. And I really do love their byline at the bottom, right? That this is the people's archive. This is for the people. And so even though this is institutionally supported in some way, this is an archive that has this kind of insurrectionist potential, right? It's about documenting something that future generations can then draw on. And then on the right here, you have oral history Narmada, which is about the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which happened in India, of course. And again, this was done to kind of document minoritized activisms that may not have been remembered, or maybe there was not enough interest in remembering this kind of activism in normative spaces like textbooks or other kinds of government and institutional contexts. Now, another kind of example that DH is kind of uniquely positioned to produce in this area is projects of recovery, and what I think of really as epistemic disobedience, where you break away from canonical projects to pull in and disrupt what we consider as normative knowledge. So this first project on the top here is the Black Book Interactive Project, which has actually compiled a very substantial list of Black authored literature, which has some of which has really not been researched much at all. So they are collecting all this material, it's being digitized, and there's going to be an interface produced by the University of Chicago, I believe, where you can search through it. So it's going to be, if any of you have used Bichitra, which allows you to kind of search through Tagore's work, this is going to be something similar to that. And below that, Equiano's World is a project about a literary text, a slave narrative by Oluda Equiano, widely considered one of the first kind of slave narratives. And this is a project that kind of visualizes Equiano's journeys as an enslaved man, right? So we also have these opportunities to write about literary works that have, again, been kind of ignored or marginalized, and we can do different kinds of work with them. And then on the right here is the Mukurtu platform, which allows Indigenous archivists to do really interesting work. And this is a really interesting platform for those of you who are interested in archiving. I do recommend a look at it, because what it does is it actually does very interesting things with access, right? If we kind of go back to that word, it allows Indigenous nations to decide who has access to their cultural heritage and how you are going to access it. So everybody does not have to have equal access to all knowledge that's out there. Certain knowledge may be reserved for members of that Indigenous nation, and for those of us who are outside of that nation may have access to different kinds of knowledge. So it's about respecting Indigenous epistemologies, right? We don't just digitize everything and put it online, but we really kind of think through these issues of who should be reading what, right? Or who should be accessing what kind of cultural knowledge. And then lastly, we also have these kinds of new networks and collaboratives in the digital humanities. Detention Solidarity Network was actually started by grad students, right? And Sujata Subramaniam is one of them. She just published a really interesting article on Bahujan girls' TikTok activism. So if any of you are interested in social media, I would also recommend a look at that. And then Orinam on the right is a project, it's actually an NGO that was founded to do advocacy for LGBTQ issues. But they also have photo archives, they have a blog where they document storytelling projects. And again, these are ways in which people can come together and talk about issues that are not talked about in mainstream media. And this is really kind of another possibility of digital humanities work, digital humanities projects, that we can reach outside academic spaces, right? Our work can cross outside into public audiences, and we can work outside our academic communities, really. And what was really remarkable, I think, about all of these projects is their investment in challenging hegemonic norms and in centering minoritized experiences. The last example I want to show you is how this might look in the classroom, right? Because I know many of you are educators, and I do want to kind of show you one potential possibility of what DH can do for us in the classroom when we want to have these kinds of conversations. So this example is from one of my classes. I taught a class on digital literary studies a few years ago, and the class was themed on race and immigration. So we were reading especially Caribbean literature that particular semester. And as part of the assignments, my students visited a local museum that had an exhibit on Caribbean art that semester. And they also attended some events by Edwidge Dantic Art on campus. Now, of course, we're all virtual, so you can still do a virtual museum visit and have students listen into a virtual talk by literary authors. For the assignment, students were asked to take up one literary text and one artistic text and examine points of intersection in the two texts. For example, representations of the Haitian Revolution in literature and art. And they had to do research on that event or the people or trace certain ideas that emerged in the two texts. The assignment was collaborative and public-facing. By the end of the class, we had 13 short essays exploring colonialism, revolution, gender, spirituality, and so on in the Caribbean context through literary and artistic texts. Their multimodal essays were uploaded to our Omeka exhibit. And you may have heard about Omeka already in the course of this conference. Fairly accessible platform. The students found it easy to use. And they really wrote all kinds of different essays. For example, one student explored fathers and patrilineal heritage in Haitian culture. Several wrote about the complex roles of women as mothers, revolutionaries, as workers in Caribbean culture. And this particular essay actually looked at Olive Sinier's poems and looked at this artistic work as well from this museum about Toussaint Louverture and so on. So the goal of this assignment was not only aesthetic appreciation of literature, of literary and artistic works, but also for students to discover how literature speaks to social and political events. The immediate context of this course was that the American president at that point had made a number of derogatory remarks about immigrants. And he had called Haiti a shithole country. And I'm not kind of saying that, that's actually what he said, right? So my students had been hearing this. And as an educator, as a literature teacher who teaches about Haiti through literature, the question for me was, what do I do about this, right? I found myself very uniquely positioned to facilitate a conversation about race, immigration, and labor. The students themselves were very thoughtful. They had heard these remarks in national conversations, in national news, and they seemed really excited to take this on in the context of this assignment. They were very interested in questions of audience, right? That was one of the topics that came up a lot. How could their writing help educate American public about this kind of history and cultural exchanges between the Caribbean and the United States? Who was the audience for this assignment? Could perhaps people in the Caribbean read their assignment? And how could they be writers who were ethical writers, right? Because obviously their writing, because it was public, potentially could have an impact on people, right? And on opinion. So as writers with a potentially vast audience, they had to think more carefully about the impact of their words. And along the way of creating the assignment, we spoke about public writing and scholarship that can harm people, right, who are already marginalized and vulnerable. We spoke about terminology, using the term enslaved rather than slave, for example. The students asked whether they could have colonialism in the title. Would people read something that had colonialism in the title? So there were all these kinds of rich conversations about the impact of scholarship, the impact that students can have by using digital humanities tools, right? And how can they intervene themselves as young people, as civic actors in what they were reading around them, right? And some of them obviously had issues with what they were reading. Some of them were learning about what was going on. So it became this space where they could dialogue and learn, and then also practice and put into action what they had learned. So I hope what these different examples, these different projects, both digital and pedagogical, have illustrated some of these possibilities of digital humanities. And I really want to end by just briefly mentioning some ethical considerations, because I do think it's really important to just point those out. I've kind of talked about this in very positive terms, but there are things to be careful about. So the first thing, of course, is I want to acknowledge the risks, right, that come up when we take up these kinds of activist orientations in our work. And the risks are especially important for scholars who are already minoritized and who often face gatekeeping, harassment, and violence in academic contexts. The second ethical consideration is that of urgency, right? So I'm not suggesting that we should kind of rush to fill this archival gap, rush to do this kind of work. I think slow scholarship has its merits. And we cannot see this kind of moment as a land grab, first come, first served thing. We have to be very careful, right? Who does the work and how that work is undertaken is very important. This question is especially pertinent when it comes to caste-based oppression. So both Ravinder Singh, who is on the Dharti Exec Board, and Varsha Iyer, who works on Dalit Panther archives, have spoken about the overrepresentation of Savarna voices in our circles. So who does the work? Who produces this archival knowledge? Who intervenes is really important. And we have to be aware of our positionality in these projects. And then, of course, who are we collaborating with, right? Collaboration is kind of this huge thing in digital humanities. And I think we have to think about what ethical roles we can hold in a liberatory space, right? Are we creating collaborative opportunities? Are we taking risks on behalf of collaborators? And perhaps sometimes we are stepping away to let others take the stage there. So in conclusion, I just want to restate the question at the heart of my talk, right? In this given moment, in this particular time of crisis, what are our commitments? What are our responsibilities? Who are we accountable to as digital humanities practitioners? If our students are on the streets agitating for social transformation, when and where do we join them? So thank you all for listening. I do appreciate you all, and I will take questions and comments. And I hope I have not rambled on.
Wow, that was a wonderful session. And I think we have a lot of things to think about. So, Dr. Sean, would you like to comment in the beginning?
Okay, sure. Yes, I'll say there's. I want to make sure we have time for the questions, but this is thank you for your wonderful presentation. There's one thing I've been thinking about, and this is partly in my working with kind of people who are kind of closer to my generation, who came from the kind of out of the post-colonial, working kind of post-colonial studies. I think it's what I really appreciate about are the dialogues with people. There's a lot of intellectualism that's attached to it as well. And I'm trying to think about. I think one area that might be interesting to think about would be maybe British cultural studies as sort of a model, but updated for the 21st century. Something where they would have these television shows and these these kind of representations and discussions like that. And the other issue that we were thinking a lot about is multilingualism and how to go about kind of basic education that will be accessible across languages. So these are things we hope to talk more about with you in the future. The other area that I think open access is really seems to be one of the the best ways to move forward. And so we're thinking about minimal computing. And I love what you've done with the Omeka teaching. That might be something, Nishad, ma'am, to think about for Jamia, maybe getting an Omeka S installation, and we can arrange the training for that, because Sharon Leon is actually at MSU, one of the people running the team, so Sharon's running that, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick is running this big digital Humanities Commons project. So just FYI, you don't want to get stuck with one of those big software projects. It's so much work. Oh my goodness. But let's get to the questions. Yeah, thank you so much. I think the thing I want is
you say something.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear more about the textbook project, and also I think another area that we should think about for our next conference would be in pedagogy, and I think that would be something that would be great, and I think you have a lot to contribute to that. All right, thanks. Yeah, please go forward with the questions.
There is a question by Sango. He asks, do you think we need to look at the question of quality control with regards to open digital access repositories? I am thinking in terms of the kind of theses that are available on Shodhganga, not only in the field of adaptation studies, but also other fields of research.
So quality control is interesting, and I wonder if this is coming out of the sense of peer review, right? When we think about academic publications, we are used to thinking and having some kind of peer review to ensure that the scholarship is, making contributions and whatnot. I'm not entirely sure how these websites vet what comes to them, right? That I am not entirely sure about. But yes, I do think, when you do any kind of open access digital project, digital library, digital archive, you do have to be careful about the material that you are getting. And I say this because I have heard of digital archives where you do crowdsourcing. I think there was a 9/11 related, not 9/11, there was a project related to the Boston Marathon bombing, which happened a couple of years ago in Boston. And they were collecting these crowdsourced narratives of people who had witnessed the bombing or who had been in the area. And they actually realized that they were getting racist submissions, right? So when you have a crowdsourced project, do you post everything you get, even if you are getting these kinds of violent responses in your submission box, right? So you do always have to have some kind of committee, some kind of moderation policy to decide what happens when you get material that is violent, or which perhaps does not meet your project specifications, right? Which is not, again, to be confused with gatekeeping, because you're not trying to limit what can be said on your platform, but really just kind of being attentive to some of these ethical issues. Yeah. So I can't speak specifically to Shodhganga, but I do think most of these projects do have to have some kind of internal moderation.
The next question is from Kashish Dua. She asks, how do you see the digital space being utilized to strengthen structural oppressions? What can digital humanists do to subvert such digitally perpetuated and sustained oppressive regimes?
This is, Kashish, you are asking difficult questions here. What can we do? And I think the first thing I'll say is, I find, now I don't know, who you are, but I do think one of the most promising areas is with pedagogy. And what I do in the classroom every semester, even if it is small groups of students, is so significant, right? Because you have an attentive audience of students every semester who are part of digital culture, who are engaging with Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all of these different platforms, who are consuming national news, which is sometimes, which can be very biased. And so I do think really one of the key areas where we can make an intervention is as educators and as teachers. And what we do in the classroom, not only in terms of making students aware, but also in how students themselves can intervene. And I think that is a very important step, right? Moving students from thinking about it to actually acting on something that they have learned through these kinds of digital projects. I mentioned Omeka in my example, but another possibility, a very easy one, is actually editing Wikipedia, which I have done in other classes. And it's a really interesting conversation, right? Just adding two Wikipedia entries, perhaps, for literatures that don't get talked about or writers that don't get talked about in the canon. And when you start doing it, the students begin to see the problems, right? And they also begin to see that they can do something, even if it is small, in making a difference and trying to redress what they've seen. So that I think is really the area for me as a scholar and educator. It's the pedagogical part of this that I think has such a powerful impact in terms of addressing structural oppression.
There's a comment by Professor Nishat Haider. She says, one of the major concerns that academics have about the proliferation of internet-based sources are that of intellectual authenticity and accuracy of transcription. What I want to point out is the lack of a peer review process on the internet, which makes it difficult to identify the academic validity of much of its content.
Now I'm not sure that I'm seeing this. So I think I'm trying to understand what
Oh,
the question is. So is this
no,
about like
it's just a comment.
misinformation?
It's a comment.
Okay, okay,
Uh,
okay. I mean, there's
the
a lot that's being talked about in terms of misinformation and fake news, right? I'm sure this has been a conversation in India with WhatsApp and how people get sent, fake news articles and fake videos. And you do have to be very careful, which is again the pedagogical part is so important because we can talk to our students about these things.
and that's what her further comment is, that also in the discussion on digital library development, we end up talking predominantly on technical issues which receive more attention than human interactions with digital library systems. Hence, designs must be different for different audiences.
Definitely, definitely.
There's a question by Juby. She asks, ma'am, what is your take on cancel culture, especially when it takes place in the digital world and doesn't have any real ramification outside the screen?
This is a really good question. I have to say, I think cancel culture as a term itself is very fascinating because so many times I think what is called cancel culture is actually about holding people accountable, right? It's about holding people in power accountable for something they have said or done, which then kind of gets framed in this way as you're taking away their freedom of expression or you are canceling them. And very often I think as this person as this I forget the name of the person who
Juby.
asked the Jupi, does Jupi points out, very often there are not real world consequences, right? These people are not held accountable. Maybe we talk about it digitally and that's where it stops. So I'm not entirely sure what the question was.
Should
Let
I
me,
repeat the question? I,
especially when it takes place and doesn't have any real
um,
ramifications outside the screen. And this is again something that we've seen a lot, I think, in feminist circles. I don't know if there has been a talk in the conference about harassment online that women face or gender minorities face, and conversations where people have tried to hold men accountable. I think a big example in India would be the Losha list, right, which got talked about a lot, and I think has kind of fallen out of conversation at this point. And this is again a place to join something like feminist studies with digital humanities, right? So we do have these opportunities to bring in disciplinary knowledge, methodological approaches from our fields to these digital conversations, right? And I do think this would be a very interesting paper to take up. So Juby, I would definitely encourage you, if you're a student, to write about this, right? Because we have all of this new, we have these new spaces, right, that have to be written about, that we have to address critically. And this is again a place for humanities scholars to enter the conversation. So we are not just talking about technologies and the utopian possibilities of technologies, but we're also kind of addressing the limitations of these spaces and how they allow certain kinds of activisms, but they also are not, perfect spaces. They're not spaces perhaps of the kind of change that we do want to see.
There's a question by Nandini Kalita. She asks, undoubtedly, technology plays a very important role in digital humanities. I was wondering if you find Heidegger's assertion about enframing, which according to him is the essence of technology, useful while trying to understand how digital humanities work. Do you think being alert to the dangers of enframing, which may lead to a kind of instrumentalization of human beings, is important while dealing with technology?
Now this is an interesting question, and I will say something right off the bat, which is that I am not very much interested in Heidegger's work. And I'll say that very honestly, not as a kind of rejection of his work, but I'm trying very careful in my own scholarship to think about theorists who get marginalized in work, right? So I'm situated in post-colonial studies and Asian American studies, and most of my work draws on scholarship from those fields, right? So because this is also part, as I said, of collaboration. Who are we thinking with, right? And in my own career, I've made a choice to think with minoritized theorists, right? Who do not fall within the white, Western, or dead white men canon, right? As we would say. In terms of this question about Heidegger and in framing and the instrumentalization of human beings, I see this question here. I mean, are you thinking about like what happens to human beings in the technological age? I'm curious about where the question is coming from. I mean, I do think we have to be careful about any claims made by digital technologies, especially when they are these kinds of utopian claims, right? At the end of the day, digital technologies are not going to solve our social problems, they're not going to solve our political problems. And we do have to see them as not neutral spaces or not as neutral apolitical tools, right? So I do, even though I am a digital humanities practitioner, I do take a bit of healthy skepticism to the claims made by these tools. And we really have to work through them, I think, to accomplish what we want as humanities scholars, as folks who are interested in kind of these activist orientations. And what I might suggest is perhaps the work of Ruha Benjamin, who has been publishing really fantastic work in Black digital studies, where she talks about, I forget how she frames it, but she talks about pulling machines into our revolutions, right? So, how do we see ourselves not simply in opposition to digital technologies, but seeing these tools as ways that will help us accomplish our own goals, our own kind of activist movements? So I might suggest her work, and she is a sociologist, Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree, for that session. I think Dr. Sean Pugh is saying something.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I just read in. Yes, and you can give the final close after the answer. Okay. So, sorry. So, yeah, thank you so much. I think what's so sad, but true is just even basic pedagogy is activism these days, particularly in relation to things like involving a lot of involving the digital and stuff like that. So I think that that's something that we should all work together on in terms of promoting data literacy and understanding privacy and thinking about ways of adapting and working with the digital tools in order to serve our audiences and the general needs too of the public. And so this is a wonderful close to the conference proceedings, as it kind of brings us wraps so many of the issues together. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Sean, for your comments. Thank you for chairing the session, and many thanks to Dr. Dhanashree for that amazing lecture on activism, digital humanities, and especially that brings a pressure to the all the literary scholars, how that always it has to be linked with the idea of activism, and there needs to be something which the literary scholars have to give to the society. That's that's something and with the many websites that you share about the diaspora and Caribbean literature and all these, so how these network solidarities can be built on a digital interface and the collaboration between DH scholars. That was a really, really interesting and amazing session. Thank you for that. Now I pass on to Zahra and Asra for the conference report and concluding of the conference.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you, Professor Pugh, for sharing the session. Dr. Dhanashree, it's so nice to finally meet you. I've been following you, as I said, on Twitter, and it's just great to be face to face, even if it's through a screen. So we're also delighted after hearing you, and it's been a great valedictory session, the perfect, endpoint to the day. We just have a short conference report that Asra is going to read out. Asra, on to you now.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
And it's not a short report, Zahra. It's quite long, and I'll try to just do it within the time that has been allotted. So, a 2-day online international conference on confronting the global, exploring the local, digital apprehensions of poetics and Indian literatures was hosted by the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, from 21st to 22nd December 2020 on Zoom. Supported by the Scheme for Promotion of Academic and Research Collaboration, Ministry of Education, Government of India, the conference was organized in collaboration with Michigan State University, USA. Professor Nishad Zaidi, the head of English Department, JMI, and the conference chair inaugurated the conference by giving the welcome address. Jamia's Vice Chancellor, Professor Najma Akhtar, welcoming all the international and national intellectuals and research scholars from different disciplines, highlighted the importance of the emerging field of digital humanities and the possibilities it has for the future of humanistic inquiry in India. Elaborating on the themes defining the conference, Dr. A. Sean Pugh, Associate Professor, Michigan State University, discussed the kind of collaborations required for digital humanities practice to flourish in a multilingual space such as India. The first session was the keynote session. Our keynote speaker, Professor Amardeep Singh, began by highlighting the gaps in existing digital archives that he described as disparities between the representation of white authors and authors from the post-colonial world. Professor Singh argued that the digital editions of writings by writers from the global south, especially India, are rarely available. Most existing digital editions are based on Anglo-American authors. Mr. Yusuf Saeed's reading of the cult of YouTube mushairas in India's small towns opened up a new world of research on popular cultures of Urdu language in the present society. Mr. Saeed spoke about how the digital medium is keeping the traditional mushaira form alive in small towns. Professor Nirmala Menon's talk began by referring to Dr. Shouvik Mukherjee's provocative essay, No Country for E-Lit, and she highlighted the multiplicity of electronic literature in India. Her talk was particularly interesting for she explained how the digital medium has engendered a hitherto non-existing space where users can engage with the multilinguality of Indian literature. The second session had 4 paper presentations and it was chaired by Dr. Shouvik Mukherjee. The first presentation was made by Professor Nishat Haider, who in her paper titled Narrative and Play, Some Reflections on Video Games Based on Bollywood, looked at the aesthetic connection between Bollywood films and video games. Shruti Sarin, in her paper titled The Internet in the Context of Indian Women's Poetry in English, looked at the idea of gift economy, which is a virtual space created by the poets to facilitate each other's work, offering criticism, publication opportunities, etc., beyond the economic concerns. Abby Biswas, in her paper titled Putting the Local in the Global Indian Graphic Novels, the New Vogue of the Indian Writings in English, looked at the Indian graphic novels and how they lie in this intersection of local and global. Samya Brata Roy, in his paper Hitman 2 and its Spectre of Mumbai, A City Lost in Translation, looked at the case of a literary work, The Monkey's Paw, which first got adapted for screen as Extraction and then got adapted into a video game called Hitman 2 Mumbai. Then we come to the third session, which was the plenary. In the plenary, uh, there were three paper presentations, and the session was chaired by Dr. Dibya Roy. The first paper, titled Archiving Communities' Voices in Karbi Anglong, Collective Memory and Digital Apprehensions of Digital Apprehensions by Dr. Debashree Dattare, dealt with the intersection of oral narratives and digital techniques. The second paper, titled Digital Archives for Indian Literatures and Cultures, Challenges and Prospects, was presented by Professor Parth Sarthi Bhaumik. The paper was based on personal experiences of working in various digital archiving projects in the British Library, UK, and the School of Cultural Texts and Records, Jadavpur University. The main focus of the paper was to look at different challenges in building and curating digital archives for Indian literatures and cultures. The third paper by Dr. Reema Chaudhary was titled Modeling Qualitative Analysis for Visual Art Forms and Epistemological Approach. The paper illustrated the semiotic graph mapping Thug's current state of banditry in India through its cinematic representation using qualitative data analysis software, Atlas TI, and Cinemetrics. The session 4, which was again a keynote address, we had two speakers. Uh, Dr. Michael Falk, who spoke on world literature at a distance, he began his talk by invoking Moretti's vision of world literature in his famous essay, Conjectures of World Literature. After highlighting the disparities of digitization efforts between the global north and the global south, Dr. Falk posited three models of world literature: the canon, the cosmopolis, the archive. Dr. Rupika Risam held a talk on rethinking digital colonialisms, the limits of post-colonial digital humanities. One of the primary issues highlighted by her was the sustainability of digital projects. She talked about the various open access archives that are devoted to non-Anglophone literatures and how the South Asian scholarship in DH is cutting across boundaries, citing Rekhta as a repository of Urdu literature. She also cited Vichitra among poetry and Iqbal Cyber Library among others. Then we come to the second day, which was today. The first session of day 2 brought together four papers chaired by Dr. Reema Chaudhary. Tanya Jalutria, in her paper titled Infusing Digital Media into Theatre in Contemporary Indian Performances, studied examples of digital theatre and cineplay. Prakriti Maniar's paper presenting Purple Pencil Project as a study of digital humanities project in practice in the field of Indian literatures proposed ideas based on her own experience of working on the Purple Pencil Project. The presentation made crucial points on the ways to increase access and awareness of Indian literatures and the methods of making such projects economically viable and sustainable. Salwa Kazi's presentation on functionality of multiple language support on social media platforms drew from the results of a questionnaire to problematize the questions of accessibility of multiple language options on social media. Devika Shekhawat's paper, The Digital Jhumur Folk Songs, Memory Migration and the Digital, trace the history of migration of tea plantation labor and the role of the migrant population in shaping the histories and cultures visible in Jhumur songs and performances. In session 2, we had two keynote speakers. Dr. Maya Dot from Flame University, who spoke on digital cultures in India, digitality and its discontents. Her lecture stressed not only on the possibilities inherent in digital humanities, but also on the lack of accessibility of digital resources and tools, particularly within the Indian context. Charting the trajectory of culture as spanning the analog and the digital, Professor Dodd argued that Indian digital cultures are marked by an intersection of multilingual, multimodal, and polyvocal practices underlining such cultures. Then we had Dr. Shauvik Mukherjee from CSSSC Kolkata, who spoke on voices of the missing subaltern poetics in Indian video games. Dr. Mukherjee deliberated on the conception of agency that underscores the plot, narrative, and action of digital games. By examining the default logic of video games as built upon the assumption of selfhood, Dr. Mukherjee critiqued the notion of entitlement and empowerment. Session 3 had four paper presentations chaired by Dr. Shanmuga Priya T. from Lancaster University, Avanti Chatri from Jawaharlal Nehru University in a paper titled Performative Politics in Digital Spaces, an analysis of Lokshiri on YouTube, spoke about the various musical subcultures coming up on YouTube and how they challenge the caste and class hierarchies through an in-depth analysis of the works of poets of the public. Parth Sarkar from IGNU, in his paper titled Potential Risk and Public Mind, a study on Facebook poetry and Bengali literature, spoke about the democratization of literature through the new facets of social media. G. Chaitanya from CLEF, in his paper Digital Diaspora in Dalits, talks about the spaces of solidarity offered through social media and digitized spaces and emphasized that it has changed the position of Dalits in the international and national scenario. Abiral Kumar, who is an independent researcher, um, in his paper Unscripting the Narrative, the special case of Hindi Urdu audiobook had taken up the field of audiobooks and the digital platform of Audible and Storyteller. Then we had the plenary session chaired by Professor Nishat Haider, where Dr. Shanmuga Priya T from Lancaster University presented a paper on qualitative stepwise analysis of the impact of technology in Indian English novels 1947 to 2001. She did a remarkable study using a code that she herself developed, inspiring us in the DH field. The possibilities, she reiterated, are endless with the kind of comparative analyses that can be done of various literatures using keywords and sentences to cull out trends and biases therein. Then we had, of course, the just concluded valedictory address by Dr. Dhanashree Thorat, who explored the questions and possibilities that digital humanities practitioners need to deal with. This includes taking up the broader question of how DH practitioners can respond to socio-political emergencies in their local and national communities. She further discussed the democratizing potential in open access publishing, sharing texts and archives with broader and new audiences, and destabilizing canonical formations. Finally, putting light on the question of what DH scholars can offer to activists, there were several websites and Solidarity web networks she mentioned as examples of what digital humanities can offer. So that was the report, and we had a very engaging session. And now I pass on the mic to Professor Nishad Zaidi for the concluding remarks. Word of thanks.
Thank you, Zahra, for this very comprehensive, amazing report, which kind of once again makes us very proud of this conference. Um, but as they say, it ain't over until the fat lady sings. So I believe it's time for the fat lady to sing. So it is, as this 7-day workshop and 2-day international conference comes to an end, it is indeed my privilege and pleasure to propose this vote of thanks. Um, First of all, of course, to the Ministry of Education and SPARC, which has, created this space for Indian university and for a department like us and for people like us to forge these kind of collaborations and take up projects. So definitely, this was a unique idea, and we must give credit to the Ministry of Education for a program like this. Then I would like to express my gratitude to Jamia Millia Islamia Administration, the Office of the Vice Chancellor, the Office of the Registrar, the Office of the OSD. I would also like to express my gratitude to my own office staff, that is the office staff of the Department of English. And here I think I can, mention Mr. Ashok Kumar, Irfan, Mangal Prasad, and even Muhammad Ali, who have always been very active. Whenever we need them, they always offer the support. Uh, to all the keynote speakers, plenary speakers, and paper presenters, without whose intellectual investment this conference wouldn't have been possible. So a big thank you to all of them. Then I would like to express my gratitude to all the rapporteurs. Without their active involvement, we couldn't have organized this conference, with the kind of the success that we have managed to organize. So I would like to take all their names. Rohan Chauhan, and I must make a special mention of Rohan, who is not a Jamia student, but we keep forgetting that he's not a Jamia student. He's very much a part of our DH team. So Rohan Chauhan, then Ankita Kaushik, Anab Nayyar, Stephen S. George, Grace, Mariam, Kashish Dua, Indrani Das Gupta, Ruchi Nagpal, Jubi C. John. A big thank you to all of you. It's your work, which has made this conference possible. Then of course, to two superstars of this conference, Zahra and Asra, who have run the show, who have made this possible. So yes, clap for them. Yes, great. Then finally, to my partner, collaborator Sean Pugh, for showing up at odd hours and attending some of the sessions. I know it was not possible for him to attend all the sessions, so thanks to all of you. I must also make a mention of my DH team, Jamia DH team. Many of them were not actively there, but I know that they attended all the sessions. Their intellectual investment in the conference, the questions that they asked, that is what made the conference, the success that it has been. I can make mention of Sango Bidani, of Niharika. I may forget names, but my entire DH team at Jamia, you are the reason why we are able to even dream of moving on with our DH project. So a big thank you to the entire DH team. And then in the process of organizing all this, I have found friends, in the field of DH, and I'm very grateful to the support that they have extended to me. And I must mention Nirmala Menon, who has been a big support. Shavik, who has been a big support. So Shavik, Nirmala, and even conversations that I had with Dhanashree, which helped me visualize and think of the conference in the way in which I could finally think. So thanks to all of you. It has been very taxing, but at the same time very enriching, and we all have taken back something to think about, something to work on. So thank you very much for being here, for joining us, to all the colleagues from Jamia, from other universities, all the participants, all those people who attended the conference. Big thank you to all of you, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaidi. Before everybody rushes away, please switch your videos on if it's okay with you, so that we can take a really nice Zoom selfie. You can throw up peace signs or as you wish. Yeah. So, okay, I'll wait for 2 seconds. I know everybody wants to comb their hair. That's fine. All right, say cheese. Okay, yes, you're all free now. And of course, thank you so much to Professor Zeri, the person who started all this. We're really indebted to you. And I know we have lots and lots of plans, and we've been discussing future collaborations. So you'll see us soon again in your DMs and emails. That's it. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone,
Yes,
and good morning to those starting their morning.
absolutely.